Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Andrew is still pressing the flesh, so we will, we'll allow him to say hello to all of his friends and relations in the room. My name is Duncan Wood. I'm the director of the Mexico Institute. It's a great pleasure to have you here. We were planning to kick off 2015 with this event, but as it turned out, we had the head of Mexico City's government, Miguel Mancera, here last week, which actually became our inaugural event for this year. Let me just say that we decided to begin 2015 with an event focusing on citizen security, partly as a continuation of the work that we've been doing over the years, obviously, but also because we are trying to make this an annual event in January so that you can all have this on your calendars, that January will be the Wilson Center's Mexico Security Review. So this is the second incarnation of that. We began last year at a critical moment when, of course, the Michoacan Autodefensas was taking place. We continued with a lot of other security work throughout the year. But the idea is that this January will allow us a space and a time in which we can sit down and reflect on what has taken place over the previous 12 months. The other annual events that we're planning for the Mexico Institute will focus on the issue of borders. We will have a border event every June. We will also have an event in September focusing on North American energy. And then lastly, we have a closed event every November on innovation policy, where we bring up Mexican legislators to talk to them about best practices in innovation and in policies that inspire and promote innovation in the Mexican economy. That's been a very successful program over the last 2 years, and we're delighted to see that that will actually be sustainable in the near future. Second point that I'd like to make is that for this year, we've taken the decision at the Mexico Institute that the rule of law will be our hilo negro, will be our transversal or mainstream theme for the year. So no matter what issue we're dealing with, we'll always try to include some discussion of the rule of law in that. Obviously, the question of citizen security is fundamental in that. We also plan to have events on justice reform, on the question of transparency in government and business practices. And lastly, we're planning an event on fighting corruption in Mexico before the summer. And the next event that we're actually going to have will be next week on the 28th of January. We'll be launching our global fellow, Luis Rubio's new book, which is called A Mexican Utopia, The Rule of Law is Possible. That book will be coming out in the next few days, so please look for it on our website. It'll all be downloadable, as of course are all of the papers that we're presenting here today. Let me say a few words about these papers. We're very fortunate that thanks to support that we've received over the past few years, we were able, of course, to produce a book, which I'm sure you've all seen, Building Resilient Communities in Mexico, Civic Responses to Crime and Violence. And we had some funding left over from that book project, and so we were able to commission more papers looking at different areas of Mexico. We're delighted with the 3 papers which came out of that particular project that we have here today, looking at the cases of Michoacan, Guerrero, and then the case of the impact of violence on voter turnout. But we also are presenting 2 other papers, one by Catherine Haar, who is here with us on this first session, on this first panel, which looks at the interplay between violence and energy projects in the states of Tamaulipas and Veracruz, obviously an issue which is receiving a lot of press attention at this point in time. And in the following panel, a paper by Chris Wilson and Eugenio Weigand, which looks at Plan Tamaulipas as the government's response to the outbreak, or to the deterioration, rather, of public security in Tamaulipas. It's wonderful to be able to continue our work with David Shirk. David, who is, of course, our other global fellow in the Mexico Institute. And I'll turn the microphone over to him in just one second. Before I do, let me just recognize Alejandro Hope and Steve Dudley, both of whom have been fellows with us in the past and helped us out on a number of issues. We're delighted that you've taken the time to come up and be with us. So thank you so much. David, over to you.
Great. Thanks. It's strange to be sitting here a year after our discussion last year and see all the things that have unfolded. Last year, of course, we were puzzling over why Mexico hadn't turned a corner. 2013 was supposed to be the Mexico moment, and at as we organized our forum in January 2014, we suddenly found ourselves talking about militias, self-defense forces in Michoacan, and ongoing threats to Mexican citizen security. Of course, even last year, even as that year was starting, Mexico had 9 of its cities in the top 50 most violent cities in the world. Acapulco ranking as the 3rd. And of course, problems elsewhere in Tamaulipas and other problem states that we're going to talk about today. But particularly in the aftermath of this fall and the tragic massacre and disappearances of students and others in Guerrero, we felt that it was really important to try to get a better grasp of what's happening in some of the states around the country, and to really grapple with this question, because in the aftermath of Ayotzinapa and the missing 43 and so on, I think heard a lot of discussion about, has Mexico turned a corner? And in the decade or so that I've been looking at this question, I've heard that at this issue, at the security issue in Mexico, I hear this question ever so often, periodically: has Mexico turned a corner? After the Colonia Salvarcar massacre in 2010, had Mexico turned a corner because people were finally fed up enough with the problems of crime and violence? After the deaths of the sons of Alejandro Martí and poet Javier Sicilia, again, at each time, as people took to the streets and marched and tried to get the government to respond effectively to Mexico's security challenges, the question was, has Mexico turned a corner? And every time people say, this is really, anger has crystallized to a point that things can't go back to the way they were. And unfortunately, 5-6 months go by, and we find ourselves back looking at some terrible development on the Mexican security front. And it becomes very difficult to see whether there's any way out of the labyrinth, ultimately, that Mexico, of corners, that Mexico is trying to negotiate as it tries to work its way to a state of the rule of law, as Duncan described it. The rule of law is not something that you get from turning a corner. It's not something that you get, it's not like turning on a light. The rule of law is the construction of, in my mind, 3 very critical components and interlocking components. I mean, the oldest concepts of the rule of law really were focused only on the first of those concepts, and that's order. From the time of Hammurabi or Ur-Nammu, the idea of law was that the law was something that was enforced by the state on society. And in many societies that believe they have the rule of law, not mentioning any names, but the largest economy in the world perhaps now, they have order, right? They have laws that are enforced on the population effectively. But they lack 2 other components that I think are really critical when we think about the rule of law, namely accountability, and by that I mean government particularly bound by law, but also laws that are just. And these are more modern concepts. I mean, the idea that the state is supposed to be accountable to the people is a very relatively new concept. It's a modern concept, 200 or so years old in the modern system. And it really, I would argue, wasn't until the mid-20th century that states were expected to have laws that are just and justly applied. And here in the United States, what that means, at least since the 1950s and 60s, is that everyone's treated equally under the law, that the law is applied fairly and swiftly to resolve problems in society. And when you think back to what the United States looked like in the 1950s. For some people, there was the rule of law. For other people, there was not. Even today, you might argue, in the United States, for some people, there is the rule of law, and for other people, there is not. There's certainly better rule of law for more people in the United States than perhaps at any point in the past. But it really has been over the course of the last 50 years or so, maybe 60 years, that we have developed the level of confidence that we have in our police forces, such as it is, that we have developed processes that are fair for the treatment of suspects, but also for victims. And this is a process that Mexico has really begun to undergo, the process of reforming the administration of justice to promote the rule of law only very recently. You know, in the 1970s, we were still fighting police corruption in the United States. Really, in the 1980s, the Rampart scandal and other places. So when we look at Mexico and we say, you know, when is it going to turn the corner? I think we have to really think in a long time frame. I always say when I'm on this stage that I'm an optimist about Mexico because I have modest expectations and a long time horizon when I think about how we're going to get to the rule of law. And I think we have to keep that in mind today. But ultimately, crafting the rule of law is not just the job of the state. It necessarily involves the participation of the citizenry and of society, particularly civil society. And that's where a couple of years ago, Duncan and I, and Eric Olson, who's just walked in, and Andrew Seeley, began working on a project to try to examine how civil society, to basically take the temperature of civil society in Mexico and try to evaluate what gains were being made to advance more civic participation, more public pressure for the promotion of the rule of law. And in some ways, we tried to make that a positive story. When you read through this book, you'll find lots of case studies and examples of organizations that have stepped up to try to promote the rule of law. Organizations like Renace that have helped to push for judicial sector reforms in Mexico. We almost deliberately tried to focus on the positive. And in some ways, as we moved beyond this book project and tried to look around at some of the other things that we had not covered, it became very glaring and apparent that in places like Guerrero, which Chris Kyle is going to talk about today, in Michoacán, in Tamaulipas, we can see that the absence of a strong civil society and the threats under which citizens the threats that citizens are subjected to in those places really require much greater attention and much better solutions than we have found so far. And so that's really, as Duncan said, where this conversation came from. And I think rather than deliberate much further about it, I think we should probably jump into some of the discussion of these papers. Are we going to go in the order of the program? So if so, I'm going to turn it back to Duncan and John, who are going to moderate the panel. But I just want to thank Duncan for organizing.
Before we do, can I just say, I mean, those of you who are standing in the back, please, there are seats right here at the front, so please come down and be comfortable. You know, if people come in, please usher them in so they can find a place. John, go ahead.
Good, thanks. Thanks very much for the opportunity to participate. The panels are organized, I think, very well today. The idea, as I get it, is the first panel sets out aspects of problems related to rule of law, citizen security, and we have in this an overview, and I think David would be the person who gives us the overview. Then we have regional perspectives, and that's Chris and Catherine, and you have their biographies and their backgrounds, and you know, most of us are public policy, comparative politics. We have an anthropologist, which I congratulate you on bringing, because they have a perspective I think is very, very valuable. So 15 minutes per person, does that work for in terms? And then we can open it up to a discussion and invite the audience to participate. David, you want to start?
Sure. I mean, do you want, absolutely. Happy to go
I think
for
the
it.
biographies are here. I always think that
Great.
people can read the specifics, and then we can use the time for
Perfect.
presentation. Good.
So our paper focuses on the state of citizen security in Michoacán. At the start of last year, as we mentioned, Michoacán really loomed in the forefront of the Peña Nieto administration's major security challenges. At that time, of course, as we were actually sitting here in January of 2014, we pointed out that Michoacan, along with Guerrero and Tamaulipas, and even a couple of other places, Tabasco and Jalisco, were actually the new battlefronts, if you will pardon the expression, in Mexico's security crisis. In 2012 and 2013, we saw a dramatic reduction in violence in other places that had been long plagued by high rates of homicide and other kinds of extreme forms of violence, and also organized criminal activities, drug trafficking, extortion, et cetera. And the shift in attention to Michoacan, Guerrero, and these other places was partly due to this dramatic reduction, but also partly due to the emergence of new phenomena, new problems that we really hadn't seen or hadn't been paying attention to before. On the one hand, the diversification of organized crime groups and the fragmentation and diversification of organized crime groups contributed to the emergence of new organizations, the La Familia organization, the Nuevo Cartel Nueva Generación de Jalisco, and other groups that we hadn't seen before, that were not familiar to us. I mean, those of us who had been looking at organized crime for a long time in Mexico had it really easy in the 1980s and 90s. There were a handful, you could count the groups on one hand. Starting in the 2000s, however, and in part because of advances made by the Mexican government, we saw a fragmentation effect. Taking out the top leaders of Cartel A would lead Cartel B to come in and try to take over territory, which led to clashes, splintering, and other kinds of problems, which, in other words, more violence, more fragmentation, and then that begat, of course, more violence. But the other thing that I think we started to see as a result of this fragmentation effect was an almost necessary restructuring of organized criminal activities or entrepreneurial activities by organized crime. Because if you're not Sinaloa, if you're not the Sinaloa cartel, if you're not a major cartel organization with both the supply chain and the logistical capacity and the ability to bankroll very large transnational drug trafficking operations to move product from the Andean region all the way into the United States, you've got to look elsewhere to make your money. And, you know, there are always, you know, jobs at McDonald's, but they don't quite cut it if you've just if you've just been severed from your, that's a bad word, sorry. If you've just been downsized from your major cartel operation, the Beltran-Leyva organization or some other organization, if you've just lost your job in the illicit drug trafficking sector, you need to make some money quick. You've got girlfriends, you've got zoos, you've got things that you've got to pay for. And the most readily available and sort of lowest barrier to entry areas of illicit activity include things like kidnapping, extortion, in some cases moving into actual legitimate industries, lime production, avocados, either stealing product or extorting those who make it. And that's really the story, I think, in at least the cases of Michoacan. We have in the reports that you're going to read that we've produced as part of the series, and also in Guerrero, this restructuring of organized crime, as some people predicted, I think, 10 years ago, almost, when the Mexican government started trying to use a strategy of targeting kingpins, going after the upper echelons of organized crime groups in order to, in the words of the Calderon administration at the time, at least in 2006, to break cartels into smaller, more manageable pieces. I loved that line when they would say that, because it was so clearly, at least I think to some of us, so clearly problematic. The idea was they were going to turn organized crime from a national security problem into a state and local security problem. And then the local police could take care of it, right? That was a really fundamentally problematic assumption, because the assumption was that there was the capacity at the subnational level to deal with these organized crime threats and challenges that didn't exist at the national level. And obviously that was not the case. And as we've seen play out, both in Michoacán and in Guerrero, I would say also in many other parts of the country, unfortunately, that has played out with disastrous consequences, because a national security challenge, which I think drug trafficking and organized crime really did constitute in the 1980s, 1990s, and even the early 2000s, because of the corruption of the state apparatus and the infiltration of the state apparatus by organized crime elements. That is a serious problem, and it can lead to very serious dysfunctions for the state, but it doesn't kill a lot of people. But when you start to see organized crime groups using kidnapping and extortion as a means of making money, they have to kill people in order to be credible. And in some cases, they just do it because they're not very good at what they're doing, because you kill people off, then you don't have anybody to extort. But I guess the bottom line point is this larger picture really has played out in a very negative way. I use the example of Michoacán. I'm just going to run through a couple. Duncan said, I said to Duncan, I have about 120 slides, and he said, I give you 5. And so I said, well, how about 100? And he said 6. And it went like that until I got what I have here. So let me just show you what I've got. I think I got to 12 from it. But if we can just move. Oh, I got the clicker. Guy's not on the job. There we go. Oh, sorry. This is just about us. Just to kind of put in perspective the general scenario that I'm describing. I mean, even now, right, or even in the last couple of years, even actually the worst year, or the last worst year of violence, 2011, 2012, as bad as things have been in Mexico, and as much as we've seen violence in Mexico in the headlines, one of the points I always try to make, particularly for tourists, and you guys are not tourists, but you know who I mean, is that Mexico, looking throughout the hemisphere, Mexico really is kind of in the middle when it comes to overall rates of homicide. As bad as the violence that I've just described has gotten in Mexico, it's at least in per capita terms, it has not been as bad as places like Honduras, Venezuela, Belize. Now that's partly a distortion effect for those criminologists in the room. I mean, the smaller the entity, the more the concentration of urban crime and sort of the higher the per capita rates you're going to get. But it is. I think important to note that as bad as things are in Mexico, there are other places that, at least in per capita terms, are worse. We arguably have seen in the last year or two the rates of crime not continue to increase exponentially, but at least level out, if not actually diminish. I mean, when you're talking about perhaps 10 to 15% of all homicides in the country happening in one city, like Ciudad Juarez, to see that the number of homicides in that city drop into the low hundreds means you're going to have a drop in crime, almost certainly, in national homicide statistics. So it's hard not to doubt, even though there's good reason to question Mexican government statistics, and even though there are tens of thousands of people who don't show up here because their bodies haven't been found or weren't found until after the Ayotzinapa massacre, and they started digging and finding lots of mass graves. Even taking into consideration a margin of error of 5%, it seems very credible that the homicide rate in Mexico is actually trending downwards, as hard as that might be to believe. What we have seen over time, of course, is starting in the mid-2000s, we saw that most of this violence was really quite concentrated in major the sort of Golden Triangle region, but also Michoacan and Guerrero. We saw gradual increases there and spreading to other parts of Mexico, particularly northern Mexico. And in the last year or so, we've seen very heavy concentration. This is from our April 2014 report, which showed that even in 2013, almost 15% of homicides in Mexico were concentrated in the 5 largest municipalities of the, in the 5 most violent municipalities of the country. And of course, the hotspots that we've been describing, Sinaloa, Acapulco, Sinaloa, Guerrero, Michoacan, tend to show up here. Interestingly, I'm so sorry about this. You can't really see the line. We also saw, as homicides have gone down, we've seen a dramatic increase in reported extortion cases, in the number of reported kidnapping cases, and also high-profile homicides of mayors and reporters over the last, particularly the last 4 or 5 years. I mentioned the fragmentation of organized crime over time. What's been remarkable about the last year is that, in fact, the 2 major poles of organized crime that remained by the beginning of 2013, the 2 major organizations that were contending for different locations in Mexico, the Zetas and the Sinaloa cartel. Well, the Zetas in late 2013, but the Sinaloa cartel in 2014, both suffered very significant leadership disruptions. And unlike during the Calderon administration, I mean, every time the Calderon administration took out a major leader of one of the cartels, we saw violence unfold as a result. There was some kind of schism. Somebody went in to try to take over turf, or the organization broke apart. That didn't happen to Sinaloa. It didn't happen, evidently, to the Zetas. So the Peña Nieto administration is obviously good at something that the Calderon administration was not. What is that? It's not entirely clear. They've either scared the Zetas and the Sinaloans into not having some kind of post-decapitation conflicts, or something else is going on. And some people have speculated that it's some kind of collusion, some kind of bargaining behind the scenes. It's difficult to know. That's not something we can prove. But something is clearly different. There's something clearly different going on in this administration than in the previous administration. So let me very quickly talk a little bit about Michoacan. In Michoacan, of course, Michoacan is really where much of this story started. It was in Michoacan that the Calderon administration first deployed 7,000 troops back at the beginning of his administration. It was his home state. The idea was to try to recapture lost spaces in Michoacan, and to take on, particularly at that time, the Beltran-Leyva organization, which was working in collaboration at that time with the Sinaloa cartel. As time went on, schisms and conflicts between the Sinaloa organization and its allies and the Gulf cartel and its allies, who then later split to form the Zetas, led to a real battle, an internal battle for Michoacan that led to the outgrowth of a regional organization then known as the La Familia organization, which was contending outside control by other organized crime groups, particularly the Zetas. And subsequent to that, after the supposed death of its leader, who then resurrected himself, the La Familia organization reemerged or sort of reformulated itself as the Knights Templar organization. What has happened as a result for Michoacan over the last year or two is that violence, or I should say, homicide rates have gradually increased somewhat. Homicide levels in Michoacan are still nowhere near what we saw in Ciudad Juarez, in Chihuahua or in Baja California or Nuevo León or even in Guerrero right now. But what's been disturbing is about the characteristics of some of this violence, and also the fact that it bucks the trend. Michoacan is one of a few places in the country that violence actually increased in 2013, and from what I can tell, in 2013 as well. We've actually, no, from 2014, it's actually a little bit down. But we see Michoacan and Baja California. Where's Baja? It jumped out of the slide. But Baja California was one of two leading states that actually saw a reversal of fortunes in terms of the number of homicides. Sorry, this is not easy to read. Much of that violence is concentrated in rural agricultural districts and municipalities, places like Apatzingan. And particularly when you look at the concentration of homicides per capita, we see these growing and transportation areas or distribution areas for drug trafficking severely affected by the violence that we've seen in Michoacan in the last year or two. The other thing that stands out, of course, about Michoacan is that unlike anywhere else that we had seen in Mexico previously, there was a very sudden and organized response from civil society in the form of so-called autodefensas or self-defense groups. In late 2013 and early 2014, these groups became very prominent. They appeared to be a reflection or an outgrowth of the frustrations of local entrepreneurs and businesses, particularly growers, who were funding and supplying concerned citizens to take to the streets and try to take back their communities. There, of course, was speculation, and there's ongoing debate, even among the autodefensas, about whether some of them have been supplied and supported or involved with organized crime groups. And that tension between these self-defense forces has continued even after they have been effectively deputized by the Mexican government in the creation of rural defense forces. As recently as the last few weeks, we've seen running gun battles in the streets between deputized opposing self-defense forces. And so when we sat here a year ago and said, you know, is this a positive development to see citizens, untrained citizens, taking up AK-47s and other illegal weapons in Mexico? Many of us said, not such a good idea. This could go in a very bad direction. And I think at best we could say that there has been mixed success for the self-defense the transition of self-defense forces into rural defense forces regulated by the state. But I think a more honest assessment, a more frank assessment might be that this was not a good idea in the first place, and one has to wonder whether the Mexican government really had many options. To attempt to disarm the self-defense forces could have been bloody, but to not do anything and to not to allow these groups to roam through the state without any kind of intervention would be problematic. Of course, what the federal government did was to try to gain control of the situation by establishing a centralized sort of, one of the people we interviewed called it a Vichy-style government in Michoacan. In other words, a federally controlled, federal control over essentially all local governance functions. And it really raised this, and I'll close very shortly, but this I think raises interesting and important questions which also come up when we talk about Guerrero. Is centralization the answer? Because in the aftermath of what's happened in Michoacan, what's happened in Guerrero, what we hear from Mexico City, what we hear from Los Pinos is that, well, what we need to do is centralize security forces throughout the country. The problem is local. Local police apparatus and local authorities are too corrupt or too inept to actually handle these problems. So we need strong state governments and state police forces to actually restore control. Well, if that were true, then Michoacan would be a shining example right now of how centralization works. And I would submit simply that the verdict is not out, and it's not entirely clear that centralization will work. And I think we should be very skeptical about proposals, the current proposal before the Mexican Congress, to try to centralize state law enforcement agencies throughout the country. And I'll close on this point. We actually just completed a survey, as far as I know, the first independent and complete survey of the Tijuana police force. It's about a 2,100 strong agency of law enforcement officers. We surveyed 90% of those officers, so it's really more of a census. And I would say that what we found is it's arguably one of the most advanced, most professional police forces in the country. They've made a lot of progress over the years. They still have enormous challenges and problems and deficits and so on. But it's a far cry from San Juan de los Camotes, right? I mean, it is a police force that actually has real capabilities. And the idea of coming in and having the state of Baja California take over local police functions is really problematic. I think in the long run, the policy solution should be, and is probably going to be, a mixed model. Here in the United States, we have a mixed model for local law enforcement. If you have the capacity, as in the case of, say, San Diego or New York City, you get to have your own local police force. But if you don't, if you are talking about rural, unincorporated, largely unincorporated areas, who's your police force? It's not the state government. It's not a local town police officer. It's a county-wide or regional entity that takes care of your security. It's a sheriff. Or a sheriff's department that's associated with the county. Mexico already has a mechanism for allowing for regional governance structures. In Guadalajara, they actually have a Zona Metropolitana de Guadalajara, and that entity has begun to incorporate and promote cooperation among police agencies in ways that help to address regional governance problems. I would submit that that's really where things are likely to go, where they need to go in terms of rethinking particularly rural security in Mexico and places like Ayotzinapa. So I'll stop there and let others talk.
David, thanks. That gives us the kind of, both things. It gives us kind of a general picture as well as a picture of Michoacan, and it sets up the discussion for Chris. And if you read in his paragraph, one of his research projects, the one I think that interests us, is social cultural consequences of newly enacted legislation to reorganize and strengthen the legal system.
Yeah, I'm not sure where you guys got that bio. It's old, but anyway.
It's here in print. That's what more could I ask? Well, tell us what you've come to tell us about.
Okay. Well, I'll come back to that, but I want to pick up right where David was talking about on this question about centralization and whether or not that's a good idea. And I'll swing back to who I am and how I know all this in a minute. But from what I see in the state of Guerrero is when centralization occurs, what it means is that the state and or federal authorities and the Army, the Marines, the new gendarmerie will sweep into town, usually a town that doesn't have the capacity to deal with the augmented population. These are not tourist towns. And so they immediately face a logistical problem. Where are they going to stay? And they set up, they will take every hotel in town, they will erect temporary barracks on soccer fields or somewhere. Oftentimes their equipment and supplies are located distant from where they're staying. So the entire thing, nobody believes they're going to stay for any length of time. They don't like it. The deployed troops are frustrated from the outset. So they're sour, having been stationed in these remote locations, and then they're, just the logistics of getting them there has been so difficult, and keeping them fed. What they do on a daily basis is set up checkpoints in cities. They will run patrols, but their patrols, they can't go out from their bases in small numbers because they're subject to attack. So they have to go in large numbers, and mobilizing a large patrol takes work. They don't do it many times a day. And so they've got an encampment which they control for sure, and the immediate blocks around it, kind of. But beyond that, they can control the territory where they're operating. But it is such an inflexible operation that that's not policing. Whatever's happening there is not policing, and it's not. It's in some ways it's worse than doing nothing, because the reason for that is because the crime keeps happening all around them. And when citizens come up and report it, they can't mobilize an instantaneous response. They have to get their big unit together, and that takes time to mobilize. So there's no swift reaction force capable of moving any distance at all. So the municipal police were actually likely to be more responsive to immediate reports of abductions, extortion, and the types of crime that are spreading terror through the state. People will report a crime, and the state police commander will say, well, the feds are in control now, go down there, and the federal police will say, well, the Army's really the one to talk to, so the Army will say, yeah, we'll do it. We've got to get orders, though, from on high, and those orders don't come, and then they get bounced back to the state police, and in the end, nothing happens. Nothing happens at all. They will trot out. The state, in particular, is good at releasing. On Twitter, they will. So success, our latest success, they'll make an arrest and showcase it for a month. But meanwhile, the extortion, the kidnappings, the killings keep happening. Who I am and what I do. I am a cultural anthropologist. I got into this business in late 2008, when I was trying to decide whether or not the reports of violence in Guerrero were sufficient to stop me from taking a group of students from my university to the wilds of Guerrero. I had done field work in Chilapa, in the middle of the state, kind of, and pretty remote location by DC standards, certainly. And right in December of 2008, I think 8 or 9 or so soldiers were snatched as they left Army base in Chilpancingo, and their bodies were dismembered and spread throughout the city the next day. And it was sufficiently jarring. We had had reports before that of violence in Acapulco and Taxco and other locations, but nothing that, they were kind of startling headlines, but it wasn't that bad. So, but anyway, in the December of 2008, there are security analysts who, we have an insurance company that hires security analysts that make a determination as to whether or not it's safe to take students into a place like this. But I didn't really, I really felt I knew more about it than they did, so I wanted to see for myself. And I do GIS software, so I just started reading the papers and putting a point in where a killing happened, and it basically became an obsession. And I've now record daily. We're averaging 4.7 or so this month, homicides a day, a shootout or two. Last night I got in just in time for a report to come out of 21 villages that have been depopulated. Population dislocation is another thing that I keep track of. But anyway, I've assembled an enormous database, GIS database that had probably the biggest database that exists outside of government circles that records this. And so, and I can see, I'm using publicly accessible sources, the press. The press in Guerrero is extraordinarily rich in their coverage. They complain about persecution and whatnot, but what I will tell you is that we couldn't replicate it in the United States. I live in Birmingham, Alabama, and we don't have as sensitive of a reporting on violence and crime here that I get from there. It's an extraordinarily efficient system. In 2011, 2012, the violence in Acapulco, as David had mentioned, got really bad, and that led to a ramping up of press outlets. They really hired more journalists to cover violence, and it actually it was harder before that to cover it than it was it became a real industry, and a lot of good crime reporters were trained during that episode. And then La Barredora, you've seen their name around and whatnot. They actually are gone. I think I'm the first one to publicly say this. They disappeared in the end of 2012. They were barely seen in 2013, but it was really that group trying to muscle its way into Acapulco that led to these skyrocketing rates of violence in Acapulco in 2011, 2012. The violence in the state was concentrated in Acapulco at that time. 2013, the numbers fell off very, very sharply. And, and then 2014, they fell off even more sharply. They did in October, they started ticking back up a little bit with Hector Beltran-Leyva was arrested in October 1st. And we're seeing a little bit of fallout in Acapulco from that. It has not sustained itself, though. It hasn't, the numbers shot up in Acapulco in October, November, and December, and in January now they're coming back down again. And so Acapulco does not look like it. I was afraid in the beginning that this was going to unleash yet a new wave of things. But La Barredora was really special in Acapulco. They were, their effort to displace the CIDA, the Independent Cartel of Acapulco, and Beltran-Leyva, Hector Beltran-Leyva's organization kind of sailed under the radar during this period. They were not as involved. That the 2011-2012 in Acapulco was mostly La Barredora and CIDA duking it out, and it was ugly. But that seems to be over. But meanwhile, the violence in other areas of the state have offset that. They've gone up in the center part of the state and around Chilpancingo. They're in the north. They've ticked up Tierra Caliente, Costa Grande. Other areas of the state have had offsetting increases in violence. I think what we saw or see over the last few years has been the diversification, the fragmentation of these organizations, as David had described. There's something in the neighborhood of 7 to 9 what I would call stable groups operating in the state at the moment. And I think that is a kind of a natural number that would reflect the number of John, you're a historian, the caciques, these domains that have been, the state has supported regional strongmen on that order of magnitude for a very long time. And so I think there is something magical in that 7 to 9 number that could be stable and durable over time. What is anomalous is the centralization that the Beltran-Leyva group had achieved in the years before. That was the anomaly from my point of view in the state of Guerrero. We've never had that kind of central control in the state. It has always been a fragmented and decentralized sort of place. But as David mentioned, these organizations have diversified their range of economic activities to include what they've done with the Beltran-Leyva group was a narcotics production, shipment, bulking from the local product, as well as transshipping cocaine from South America. The local product, by the way, is opium. The state of Guerrero, we don't know how much it produces, but something in the order of 60% of Mexico's supply comes out of the mountains of Guerrero. And that is the real prize, I think, that keeps them all interested in the state. Without that, then it's just the predatory recirculation of funds within the state. That's what's bringing new money in from the outside, and without that, then I don't think it would sustain itself. So knock out poppy production, you could put an end to it, but I don't think that's going to happen because it is everywhere. It is poppy. It's one of the only cash crops that people can make money on, and in the state, the alternative is subsistence agriculture and migration. And with the border closed down up here, migration is more difficult, and it so it feeds on itself. But anyway, these organizations have expanded into extortion, kidnapping. Those are part and parcel of the same thing. We think of them as separate entities, but oftentimes kidnapping is done to reinforce extortion threats. and they go together really well. And extortion takes a whole lot of different forms, and this is one of the areas that these groups have really been creative in devising new mechanisms. I mean, the easiest form of extortion is where taxing business operations, something where it's a cash-based portion of an economy that they moved into teachers. At one point they started demanding 50% in Acapulco was 50% of the teachers' salaries monthly was to be paid over to the drug trafficking organization, and Christmas bonuses as well. That prompted the teachers to shut down the schools in Acapulco, which they did for a long period of time. And I just add to that, schools throughout the state have been shut down periodically throughout their probably very, very few schools that have had continuous operations for the last few years without some sort of disruption. In some areas, they've just disappeared completely. There are many rural areas that have no public facilities of any sort. That includes health facilities as well as educational facilities. But anyway, understand the patterns of violence that you find in any particular location, you have to look at the balance between narcotics production and trafficking, heroin manufacturing. The manufacturing of heroin happens very close to the production site because transporting opium gum is somewhat difficult. It's a fruity smelling stuff that they don't want to move very far so the manufacturing happens close to home. And in those areas, actually, you get a lot less extortion. So you don't get extortion and kidnapping happening in the production zones. Now, a lot of the countryside is exempt from that because the drug trafficking organizations are getting their money out of that area in different ways. And you don't want to terrorize that population. They're basically working for the drug trafficking organization. So you have, and here what you get is, active collusion is the wrong word, but their money comes from their business dealings with the drug trafficking organization. So the population does not have a problem with it. That's where their money comes from. The problem arises in production zones when a second group wants to muscle its way in, and they will send in raiding parties and try to break up the existing network production and distribution, the bulking activities of the drug trafficking organization. And we've got several areas in the state where there are border zones. I mean, you read, there have been a number of kind of surveys of the drug trafficking organizations operating in the state of Guerrero that kind of have El Norte. You've got activity by Guerreros Unidos, Los Rojos, La Familia, stuff, but it's not like that. It's not. These are territorially based things that you can draw the borders between them, and those borders are extraordinarily violent areas. Some of them more so than others, but they control specific territories. It's not just several groups are operating in this town. That's not the way it works. Several groups may be killing people in that town, but one of them controls it, and the other ones are trying to displace those who control it. And in these areas in production zones between groups, we've some of them, I could go through. We've got two of them that are expanding aggressively at the moment, or one of them, Guerreros Unidos, has really been in the news a lot lately because of the Ayotzinapa affair. That was a really aggressive group that was muscling into area controlled by La Familia, Los Rojos. Another one is I've never seen in the English language press. Al Jazeera had one report on it. A thing called Los Ardios. And it's making a real mess in the town I know best, and has taken out friends of mine actually. But they're trying to control a big poppy production zone in La Montaña in the east by controlling the city of Chilapa, which is the last gas station before you get to the production zone. That's another.
Chris, can you take 2 more minutes?
Okay. Yeah, these towns with gas stations are important. They have to control those in order to control the flow of people and goods coming in and out of these areas. But anyway, to the patterns of violence are shaped not by the deployment of federal forces or the Army or the state or anything else. They're shaped by the types of opportunities that these organizations find in any specific location, whether it is drug production, whether it is simply extortion outside of the drug production zones. Extortion and kidnapping are all they're left with. And we had an expansion of that in 2011 or early 2012 into these areas of the state that drug trafficking organizations didn't have any background in, or they innovated new forms of extortion, added kidnapping to the mix, and were spreading. And that's what, in the state of Guerrero, prompted the rise of this community policing networks, where these are not things that grew up in drug trafficking, drug production zones. They're things that grew up in areas that had, up until that point, been exempt from problems, and were suddenly faced with extortionists and kidnappers and others. And I could go on for a long time about individual. We've got 6 to 8 different community policing groups. Some of them have been extraordinarily successful. It's one thing that my paper doesn't do well enough, is cite the statistics showing success in some of these, with some of them. Some of them have not been successful. But I'm not as optimistic as David, maybe, but I think it's worthwhile to look at these different groups to see what has been successful and what has not. There's a lot of experimentation on policing techniques going on down there right now, and the state has joined those experiments by creating a rural police force. They've changed the state law that allows, in a way that in Michoacan, this is something we need to talk about more, David.
Maybe this leads into Catherine's presentation. Catherine Haar is a specialist on security threats and risk management, and has turned to focus now on issues of energy and security in the case of Mexico, looking at Tamaulipas and Veracruz especially. Catherine, please.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. And I'd like to take a sincere thank you to Dr. Wood for the opportunity to explore with him my initial concept on security threat challenges to Mexico's oil and gas sector in both Tamaulipas and Veracruz, and the implications of those threats and challenges to the Mexican national security sector. And I also want to thank Dr. Wood's talented staff for their kind support during the editorial and publication process. Thanks very much. So I have a lot of detail in the paper, and what I'm going to try to do for you in 15 minutes is encapsulate the most important points, starting with the scene setter as to why Tamaulipas and Veracruz are important with respect to their current energy and future energy situation, and then how to correlate energy security to Mexico's ongoing turbulent national public security situation. And to kind of bound what you're going to hear from me today, again, I have a lot of very data-intense points in my paper. The time frame of my research and analysis was April through July 2014. And what I've done for today, of course, is updated some of my comments to reflect some recent developments. So as everyone is aware, it's been ongoing, and in my view, during this period of time, an escalation of what I call DTO drug trafficking organizations, herein referred to as DTO physical attacks on Pemex's oil and gas equities, threats to and violent attacks on Pemex personnel, and the deterioration of the overall public security landscape not only in Mexico, of course, but again, the focus being on these 2 states. And this illustrates the range of risks that the energy security sector, as well as other industries that are closely associated to the petrochemical sector, encounter in Mexico. So as a brief overview of the key energy highlights for both states, I'd like to keep your mind focused that when I talk about security challenges, my focus is going to be on DTO and DTO-related organized crime threats to Pemex's life cycle of operations. And this is primarily focused on the down to midstream range of activities in Tamaulipas and Veracruz. I saw continued and aggressive attacks resulting in the shutdown of refineries in both states, closure of roads, important roads blocking the transport of critical supplies to transport oil to gas stations, for example, intimidation of staff working at these oil and gas facilities, all at a high cost, of course, economic cost to Pemex. Just alone in 2013, the Mexico Peace Index calculated that the direct cost of violence was estimated to be almost $46 billion. Now I'd like to turn to what some of the key oil and gas opportunities and challenges are for both Tamaulipas and Veracruz. Each state does anticipate receiving and benefiting enormously, of course, from the liberalization of the energy sector that's going to permit private investment in the oil and gas sectors. And of course, the federal government already is investing billions of pesos to build new as well as to reinforce existing oil and gas infrastructure capacity for down to midstream activities. In Tamaulipas and Veracruz, I've seen, and I'm sure many of you have also noted, that there's also a lot of anticipated projects and building out of ports. So a lot of the upstream is a very important endeavor, if you will, especially as you look at linking Mexico's energy security to the U.S.'s energy security. So I know that the Woodrow Wilson Institute did a very nice paper on that North American energy nexus. So this goes to kind of support that in terms of positioning these two states. So Tamaulipas is very important. It's the home to the Burgos Gas Basin, which also straddles two states of Nuevo León and Coahuila. And it has the country's most important gas reserves, with ongoing production that exploits 2,800 holes and employs about 4,200 people. Again, I will refer you on occasion to the paper where I have a lot more data in terms of what the energy sector is and how it benefits the state, employment opportunities. And again, so when you take the longer view as to where the strategic challenges are in terms of threats to Pemex's operations, you can begin to do a cost breakdown. Tamaulipas also has a national infrastructure plan. It's dated from 2014 to 2018. And this, to me and to many others, demonstrates its intent on revitalizing its oil and gas infrastructure and production as they prepare for foreign investment. We also see the anticipated completion in December of 2015, a little under a year, of the important gas pipeline called Los Ramos, together with the construction of gas compression plants. And there's a lot of work ongoing in the port of Altamira. This is big expectations for Altamira and Tamaulipas to be able to diversify this LNG terminal and eventually to have it be a major gas pipeline to the United States. Now I'd like to move you down to Veracruz. And Veracruz is very important. Another standpoint, it does have a large crude and gas shale basin, the Chincotec, that has many exploration wells. But the ports in Veracruz are of great importance. The port of Veracruz is the main access for the state's oil, gas, and petrochemical products. And if you look at sort of the diversification and looking at pathways out of Veracruz, it sends all of its products out to the rest of Mexico. And Pemex is building out at least 4 to 7 tankers that at some point in the future will be departing, if you will, from this port with anticipated products to Europe as well as other countries in the world. So these two states are very crucial to President Peña Nieto's energy reform plan. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking on the round one bidding process, but I'll just mention very briefly that Veracruz emerged as one of the results of the round one, because there are 4 blocks, right, that are offshore blocks, and this just occurred in December. So interested domestic and international partners, including Pemex, can submit bids for these blocks. There are 2 other states involved, but again, I don't want to spend a lot of time on the round 0. That's a very intense area to discuss. So now that if I hopefully tried to lay for you somewhat this energy and security landscape, I want to move into the security challenges, which unfortunately these 2 states continue to experience really high levels of lethal and really pernicious physical threats to citizens, as well as to businesses, and of course to a lot of the 2 main DTO actors, the Los Zetas and the Gulf Cartel, really do focus a lot of their violent activities on Pemex personnel, as well as physical attacks on Pemex infrastructure. So as my colleagues have already stated, so not only do these do cartels fight one another? Sadly, they draw in so many other innocents into their fights, and the environment in these two states is very, very unstable. Just have to follow the social media reporting, the Spanish social media reporting, to see what the daily and hourly risks, situation risk reports are, and what they have to face on a continuing basis. And this landscape, if you will, these constant attacks on civilians, the kidnappings, the highest rates in Tamaulipas are in Victoria and Tampico. I've already talked about Tampico's importance in terms of energy security. It was very interesting for me to note that from one social media user, he noted that Gas Gebla is going to be closing some of the gas stations due to the continuing extortions and kidnapping of personnel, and just overall to the threats. Now, I've seen this interesting trend, or possibly a new indicator in terms of like what would be for warning if you're Pemex or a company operating there. If I'm seeing one gas station beginning to close down one station on a certain street in a certain town, and that I see throughout Tamaulipas, that many of the, maybe Pemex gas stations are closing simply because the personnel doesn't come to work because they're scared to death. And also something really important, which is really interesting, is that gas is not reaching, there's a scarcity of gas. So gas stations are closing down. And why are the gas stations closing down? Sabotage of the pipelines. And a lot of that gas ends up actually in the United States. So siphoning is a really huge issue for Pemex. And just to note that when foreign companies do come in to operate, I'm optimistic for it, into Mexico, if they do desire to open up or take over some of the Pemex gas stations, you know, how to deal with the threat risks, if you will, to your personnel and your infrastructure has to be a consideration. Already several gas stations and local businessmen traveling throughout Mexico either have and are considering contracting private security members to sort of watch over their gas stations. That's very different environment, must be extremely difficult to ensure where you have that trust, and setting up almost mini militias to circle key businesses. Another point of interest with gas stations in Mexico, the Pemex, is that you have the famous OXXO that are always conjoined with the Pemex gas station. So OXXO stores and many others are continually bombed as well, usually indirectly because they're sort of in the sight of people of the cartels attacking the gas station, but also as an intimidation tactic to scare out the employees out of that area. So you have these spaces that literally become spaces of inactivity where people can't go and work, there's no security. And so these are some of the immediate implications from this environment. Again, remember that my analysis really goes up until July 2014. I'd have to do another very in-depth study for Duncan as to what may have transpired since then. However, the range of economic activities, given the expectation of foreign direct investment into Tamaulipas and Veracruz's oil and gas sectors, will increase. And so again, I pose the question: what does that mean for the interests of the dominating cartels at the moment in those two states and their gangs of thugs? One of the areas that I'd like to focus on is the increasing civil society frustration and agitation. You have these pockets where crime and public insecurity have reigned, and there's no physical space for public citizens to go. And in Mexico, I think unlike most any other country in the world that I've been able to study, but really in Mexico being able to dive into Spanish language social media, is that the citizens have turned to social media, to Twitter, to Facebook, and they've really set up their own SDRs, as they're called, situaciones de riesgo, their own situations where they can help each other. We know that there's a lack of trust between the public citizens and their police. Some very interesting studies on that as to the lack of confidence in the municipal police, and therefore the Mexican government is moving the 32 states, of course, to the single command. So hopefully that will be something that will engender more confidence. But this increasing frustration with lack of protection and security and transparency, where even the Ministry of Public Safety and Security, the police forces. I'm not counting the two new forces that have emerged onto the scene, the Gendarmerie as well as the civil force. But there is a great sense that their hands are handcuffed, and they really have nobody to whom to appeal. So they appeal to themselves to either create self-defense groups, and these types of activities in Tamaulipas and Veracruz have been peaceful so far, but should there be an uptick in any type of violence, and should there not be an efficient and transparent, expedient process for Peña Nieto's security reform, this could be an area of agitation to look for. So at the national level, I've taken you from the sort of the grassroots up to the state level. Now at the national level, I've intimated that the government is working on various security plans, and it has implemented some important security structural reforms to try to improve the security environment, not only for the citizens, but also for businesses. As a matter of fact, the newly formed Gendarmerie, one of its main missions, is going to be helped to protect Mexican businesses, including agriculture and the energy sector. So that's a very interesting development. All of these reforms are focused, of course, on eliminating corruption, combating the DTOs, and improving the rule of law. So I don't know how many of you have read Mexico's National Public Security Plan, but Mexico sort of identifies itself as an emerging security power. Well, if Mexico wants to go beyond being an emerging security power and really having a role in this century and having a space where foreign companies and people can come and work safely and be confident and have a safer audience, if you will, where citizens are not scared. There's a lot of work that the federal government and the state governments need to do to implement the Mexico PAC, the energy reform, and most importantly, as part of Peña Nieto's 10-part reform program, there's a lot of deep discussion about the new anti-corruption initiative, which was just passed 1 month ago. This plan talks about creating a national anti-corruption commissioner. Very important for the government to get out in front of all of this with just not nice public relation campaigns, but what does it mean ultimately to these new security forces that are in these two states down to the rural level? And the quick focus on the single command. The social media seems to be indicating sort of a 50-50 right now. Mexican views that, well, we're not sure how this is going to really pan out. I've seen the Gendarmerie at some of the ports. This could be better. The municipal police was so corrupt. And as long as the Army and the Navy stay and are supporting this new single police, the state police, that will be good. Maybe we will have some confidence. So there has to be, in order for any of these reforms to work, they have to have some teeth. They have to have a rule of law process. It has to be visible to the public, because otherwise, right at the moment, public opinion is going to continue to slam the government and the police forces for not doing enough to protect their needs. And it's very important as foreign investors look to come into Mexico, into the oil and gas sectors of these two states, that there be, the perception can be everything. Ultimately, the five sisters are very interested in moving into Mexico and will set up. They'll count what the risks are. But when you look at the totality of these different developments, they all mean something. And where are the areas that a company and its investors are going to how they're going to have to protect themselves? And you cannot be operating in a country where your citizenry is always agitating for protection and for always that they're always in a position of essentially being killed. So what I would recommend is that one area of significant improvement is that the Ministry, for example, of Public Security has to have a richer website, if you will, that's going to work with the public citizens. If you look at the website of the Ministry of Public Security for Tamaulipas and for Veracruz, they're very different in their foci. Tamaulipas is very focused towards public safety alerts, just as some of the many sites that are out there specifically set up for citizens. And Veracruz is really more about talking about how well they're implementing. So there really should be more of a cohesive, coordinated effort to get these individual, even something as what would seem as perhaps as trite as a website, but it means a lot. We're back to perception. And if the state, local forces and security agencies want to draw in the public, they need to reach out, demonstrate accountability, demonstrate transparency. I was somewhat very unhappy to read that an SSP spokesman said that in Veracruz they don't really need to list all of the alerts because people don't need to worry about that. There's nothing they can do. It'll be the state police to take care of them. That really is not what I don't think, or any other Veracruzano really wants to hear. So I would argue against that and go more the way of what Tamaulipas is trying to do. So on the opportunity side, there are some bright spots in terms of the Plan Tamaulipas and Plan Veracruz as they're beginning. Yes, thank you very much. This is moving right into the wrap-up. Thank you. They are beginning to produce some demonstrable results. And it would be very exciting to be able to take the metrics and understand what are those and what do they mean by reducing the physical threats, if you will, for the citizens and also for Pemex operations, so that you can have a diminution of financial risks to the Pemex operations, be it from sabotage and criminal activities. So you really do need an improvement in this overall public security and economic setting. The two are intertwined inseparably in Mexico, and especially in these two states. Again, most of these majors are going to come in, but if the situation isn't really resolved in a manner that is going to protect the system and ferret out corruption and make sure that the police are working for the people as opposed to themselves and their drug lords, then I think, David, you asked the question earlier as to, has Mexico turned a corner? Well, right now, I'd like to be optimistic that with all of these reforms that Mexico is on the way with the hope of turning a corner. And let's hope that it continues that way. So I look forward to any questions during the question and answer session. Thank you.
Good, thanks. Thank you. Thank the colleagues for very good presentations and setting up the discussion. I like the rule of law notion, and I wonder what do we mean by rule of law, because it sounds almost lyrical. And so during the course of the year, I hope we have a chance to define what we mean by rule of law. It probably means some aspects of the police justice regulatory system more or less operate some of the time adequately and ethically. That's probably rule of law. But anyway, it's a conversation that I assume we'll have during the course of the year. Let me ask David if he'd accept one more notion in this rule of law. Today we talked about order, and we had a lot of emphasis on violence. I think Catherine got a little bit more into anti-corruption and accountability. I think that was good. Justice makes sense. Let me ask if you would add to your list compliance, because rule of law operates where citizens comply with the law. And that's an area where Mexico has, I think, some issues. But it's a discussion we'll have over the course of the year about what rule of law actually means. Do we have a round or two of questions?
Yeah, we have about 20 minutes for questions.
Great. Can we take 3 at a time? Please. And please stand up, identify yourself, and then we can make a list of questions and then have a couple of rounds. Let me start. There's a young woman in the back, and then a young woman here, and then a young man over here. Please, identify yourself, and then you can address it to the whole panel or to one or the other of the panel.
Cecilia Farfan from the University of California. I was wondering if you could talk, Michoacán also houses one of the biggest ports that Mexico has, and I was wondering if you could talk about the interaction that the increase in the consumption of synthetic drugs has had and this port in relation to the organizations. And I was also wondering if you could also address, in the case of Pemex, if foreign investors do come in and hire private security, what will be the implications for the building rule of law, especially given the experience that Nuevo León had? Thank you.
Good. There was a young woman I saw right there. Thank you. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Jessica Verrett from the Pan American Development Foundation. My question is about traditional civil society, and I guess this is for Dr. Shirk. what has happened in Michoacan to traditional civil society as the self-defense groups have risen? And are there any attempts or any spaces within civil society besides the self-defense groups where you're seeing hope or opportunity?
Good. Please.
Thank you. Richard Downey from Delphi Strategic Consulting. Thank you very much. Wonderful overview. And my question is for Catherine. And I know your research stopped July of last year, but you mentioned the siphoning and the sabotage of the oil lines that was leading to the closure of gas stations because there are shortages of gas and those sorts of things. What kind of response have you seen, whether it be Pemex, whether it be the local authorities, or again, I know your research stopped then, but what have you seen perhaps since, or what was building towards now? Thank you.
Start it.
Sure.
Maybe.
So thank you for bringing up the port. I mean, the port really has long been a critical point of control for organized crime in Michoacan. And initially, for many years, of course, the port was controlled by the Beltran-Leyva organization, and gradually became a point of contest. The La Familia organization gradually gained control after the decline of the Beltran-Leyva organization, and in recent years was taken over, or in the last year or two was taken over by the federal government. And it is not entirely clear to what to me to what extent the port has been free of corruption. I mean, there's still product moving through. Synthetic materials still very important in Lázaro Cárdenas. And ultimately, I don't think I have a very good answer to your question about how that control, what is happening in terms of that control at the moment. With regard to traditional civil society, I mean, I think it's been very difficult for traditional civil society to operate in the context of the current security situation in Michoacan. We have not seen civic organizations taking to the streets or organizing public protests outside, very significantly outside of self-defense forces and the self-defense force marches and so on. I think in many ways, it's not just civil society, but it's even government institutions themselves don't function because you have this imposed governance structure. The local government apparatus, the city governments, the presidentes municipales and the ayuntamientos are not in charge of or not functional or not effectively in control. Everything emanates through the commission that is governing the state. So the state legislature, the governor's office, et cetera, they're essentially second in their own state to the authority of the federal government. The only functioning, I mean, depending on who you talk to, but one of the few entities that is actually functioning independently as it's supposed to is the state's judiciary, which even itself has been put on hold in terms prior to 2013, 2014. The state of Michoacan was poised to enact the new adversarial criminal procedures, and has since put that on hold, partly because of the plans to move to the new unified federal code, but also partly because it was simply deemed impossible to move forward with that under the current circumstances. But I think it's very different, whether you're talking about Michoacan or Tamaulipas or Veracruz or several of these places. It's very difficult to find adequate spaces for civil society to organize and act out. And it really, I mean, we saw this in Tijuana and Ciudad Juarez and even Monterrey, which has a very dense civil society network. During the height of the violence and during the period of sort of greatest sort of the peak of sort of inter-criminal violence and state-on criminal violence, it's very difficult for citizens to step out and or stick out their necks and draw attention to themselves because they become victims, and we see that particularly for journalists who are trying to cover what's happening. So I think at least we've seen elsewhere in Mexico is that after things appear to calm down and after violence begins to die down, it's when civil society is really best able to come out and work on rebuilding, restoring confidence, et cetera. So you see things like Tijuana Innovadora in Baja California, where people suddenly are coming out and trying to take back their communities, take back their streets by just doing things. Bicycle clubs and other kinds of things to try to be present in their communities. But I think right now in much of the state of Michoacan, it's still a bit too frightening and dangerous to do that. Problems of extortion are still pretty severe, and it's hard you don't want to become a target of further violence.
Catherine, I think one was addressed to you, then we can see whether.
Absolutely. So in response to your question, thank you for asking that. What the federal government has been attempting to do in terms of like in Plan Tamaulipas as well as in Plan Veracruz, is they have trying to create, if you will, a perimeter of a deterrent strategy. So I don't really know how their perimeter strategy is working in terms of how many outliers of security, but definitely the gendarmerie has become part of that strategy. I cannot speak with any authority as to at which refineries the gendarmerie has been placed. I just haven't had an opportunity to go back and do all the research. But if you look at the logic of Plan Tamaulipas, it would make sense for the gendarmerie to be part of this security strategy, which is one of deterrence, of course. You also have, so Pemex has a very small security force. They've relied in the past completely on the military. Primarily the Army for any security. But with so many, if you will, conflagrations throughout both states, it's really hard for the military to have a full-time presence, 24/7, if you will, when they need to be pulled to other parts of it could be the same city or other parts of the state, or even out of state, if you will. So the military in that sense has been stressed. If they have an alert, so this goes back to something which is if you have a good sort of indicators and warning alert system, if you have a sense that something's going to happen, then what is that deployment mechanism? So I don't have a lot of familiarity with that. I haven't seen, I've seen in social media where individuals who live near Pemex refineries in Tamaulipas and Tamaulipas has more of this observational, I call them observation posts, if you will, than in Veracruz. Regarding Pemex infrastructure. And many of the inhabitants, be it Ciudad Mier or Tampico, will note that there seems to be some good, there are fences, Pemex security walk, if you will, the area outside of the main fence, checking the pipelines. But there was one very bold case actually back not a couple of months ago, where I'm not sure which DTO, which cartel it was, but they entered the Pemex refinery in Burgos. Sorry, it was in July. They came in with one of their, hastily made armed trucks, if you will, like the monster type of vehicle, and they literally just plowed through, and they had a lot of armed men went in, and they took the oil that they needed. So they didn't even have to. They didn't even have to rely on making their own pipes, if you will, and other siphoning paraphernalia to remove the oil. They were that bold to be able to go in. So that said something, I'm sure, to their tactics and planning as to, whatever. I mean, this seems to be, Burgos is an important refinery. You would think that there would be some good security. So to sort of recap an answer to your question, it seems to be, they've been relying on the military. The gendarmerie are going to have capabilities. They're supposed to have armored vehicles and high-powered weapons to protect Pemex assets, which, you know, we have to include personnel into that. It certainly is a really interesting area to continue to look into how that's going to evolve.
Chris,
hope
you want
that
to add
helps.
anything to the comments of the group?
Just on the port of Lázaro Cárdenas, I see spillover violence from that port sometimes in the state of Guerrero, and I have not noticed anything unusual at all. So I don't think anything has happened different from what was going on before in Lázaro Cárdenas. I guess the other thing, I am always struck, I mentioned when I was talking that the schools and medical facilities in some areas of Guerrero have disappeared, but I'm struck by how normal daily life looks oftentimes. I don't find that the municipal governments and state government has broken down. They've just broken down with policing and justice, but they have not. They continue to build water systems. They continue to build schools, even if teachers won't go there. But they continue to, and with civil society, these organizations are there. The Ayotzinapa affair brought them all out to the streets. They all marched in favor of, you know, producing the 43 students alive in the name of their organization. They were still there, and I thought they were gone too. And yet, they and their issues somehow there was a lot of struggle to link that case to the La Parrota Dam project outside of Acapulco. You know, everybody wanted to get their issue and their name back out there. So just a thought. I don't know.
Thank you. Duncan?
If I can just make a couple of quick comments. One on the positive community experiences. I mean, if you read Chris's paper, there's a great deal of detail in there about some of the projects that have been underway in terms of community policing. And you know, he mentioned in his presentation about this is in some ways a laboratory of things that might or might not work. But what it points to is that often the solution is going to be found at a very, very local level, that what works in one municipio will not work in the next one over because of either ethnic, cultural, or just, you know, topographical or physiographical differences.
The problems are often different. I mean, the types of violence they're subjected to are different, but the problems are very specific to locations.
And in response to Richard's question, I mean, I remember Jesus Reyes Robles once answering a question on pipeline theft in Mexico, and he said, look, you know, kind of, this is not my official stance as head of Pemex, but what do you expect us to do? We have thousands and thousands and thousands of kilometers of pipelines where there's no electricity. You know, we can't even put cameras there. We can't put lighting there. And we clearly don't have the manpower to police all of it. And so technology can solve some of it. There are satellite systems, of course, which you can put in place to detect changes in pressure in the pipeline. But often by the time you get there, it's too late. And the estimates of how much it costs Pemex on an annual basis vary wildly. But somewhere in the $1 billion a year mark is probably safe in terms of lost product and the damage to the pipeline system to infrastructure.
I'm going to continue with my adding items to the agenda for the year, which is what we're missing so far is systems of corruption. That is, Guerrero, one of the most interesting parts to me is the governor was corrupt. The former governor was utterly corrupt and involved with organized crime in varieties of places throughout the state. Michoacan, the former governor, was corrupted. And so the system in that sense was corrupted, and we need to add this as well. But you go on, Tamaulipas, Quintana Roo, Chihuahua, it's the system of corruption that's at the very top that permeates through the rest of the state. So we're dealing with some important symptoms, but at some point we really need to look right at the nature, bell the cat and look it right in the eye. Another round, please. A woman in the back there.
Could I just say one thing on corruption?
We got to do a round, and then you can add it in your comments. And if they ask you a question, you can answer it with what you're doing here. Good.
June Beidel with the Congressional Research Service. Catherine and David brought up Los Zetas. I would be very interested in knowing your perspective on the status of the Zetas organization in 2015.
Thank you. There was another. There's a woman here, please, and then down front, a woman here, please.
Lynn Hammergren. Catherine, I have a question for you. I just, having listened particularly to David's discussion of the fractionalization of crime and outsourcing and downsizing, I'm wondering how much of the problem as regards Pemex you can really blame on drug trafficking organizations, and how much, I mean, I would also think that sindicatos would be involved because they're not really happy about private investment.
Good point. One more question here.
Priscilla Rodriguez, I'm a human rights lawyer. I wonder for some of you, if you have some information about the links between governmental officials with illegal disappearances and killing, specifically of advocates, activists, and journalists.
Good. Start with Chris, and then we'll go to David and then
That
to
is
Catherine.
mostly related to that. The Ayotzinapa affair drew attention to the tight links between a particular municipal government and Guerreros Unidos, a group operating in Guerrero. But that was an unusually close link. He said that the governor of Guerrero was corrupt. I don't know that that was the case. I don't see a difference between municipalities where there are accusations of tight links between alcaldes and organized crime. The thing that shapes the levels of violence we see are the types of activities that are happening by DTOs in a particular jurisdiction, whether it is just trafficking or production, whether it is extortion and kidnapping, and it has nothing whatsoever to do with political party is in power, what particular administration is in office. The violence levels continue unabated from one administration to the next. Honestly, if you ask me, I think they are all corrupt or not corrupt, as however you want to think of it. I don't think you can engage in politics without coming to terms with the organizations. These are the dominant sector of the local economy, and you have to. They fund your political campaigns. Everybody. You can't run a political campaign without accepting the money from them because your rival is, and you can't. It's with big corporate entities, they can come up with investment funds, but small businesses, money is cycling through the economy. Everybody is corrupt. I don't think there is anyone untouched in the state of Guerrero, at least, by the money that is sloshing around in the state because of it. And it is too easy. I guess I'm sensitive on this point because the federal government will come in all the time, the state, somebody will come in and blame corrupt local officials as though they can just remove the administration and the local police and solve the problem. And yet they make it worse. And they will then claim to vet the cops, put them back in office, and then leave. And it's as though they've fixed the problem. And that's not the reality. The corruption is a smokescreen. It is a distraction from building the institutions. It's long-term grunt work that's got to be done. And just pointing to one corrupt official or another corrupt official is not going to help at all. I guess. Sorry.
David, please.
I'll start there and work backwards. Corruption is a long-standing problem in Mexico, and for decades we talked about corruption in political terms, and also the abuses that corruption produced, particularly in the effort to establish and maintain political hegemony by the ruling party in the 1940s and 50s. You saw political repression. You saw, even in the 1950s and 60s, extrajudicial killings or official killings, disappearances, and this kind of thing into the 1960s and 70s. And what's happened over the course of the 1980s and 90s in Mexico and into the 2000s is the proliferation of a new kind of corruption that is driven not by politics but by crime. And I think that the thing that Ayotzinapa drives home is the extent to which, in some places, particularly at the local level, there's been a fusion, if you will, of political and criminal corruption, right? I mean, in Iguala, I mean, it was partly that the Guerreros Unidos were involved and that they were running, racketeering and criminal organization or criminal operations in that area. But it was also partly that the mayor just didn't like anyone challenging his or his wife's authority, right? And that's a long-standing problem in Mexico. Is if you are a political opponent of the sitting authority, you can wind up on the wrong side of a gun or a jail cell. So I think that this is there is something new and different, and maybe it's, as Chris points out, very it's fortunately relatively rare to see such an extreme example of this as we saw in Iguala. But I do think it's disturbing because the fractionalization of organized crime has moved organized crime networks closer to those state and local authorities than they might have been in the past, and they in many ways have begun to work more closely with those state and local authorities in ways that change the nature of political corruption, as you were suggesting. And the other thing I want to mention about official killings is everyone, or to the extent that anyone knows the name and can say Ayotzinapa or Iguala in the United States with the same proficiency that they can say Charlie Hebdo. Did I pronounce that right? My French is terrible, so. I know very few words. Quelle impression avez-vous de la situation politique et économique en France? That's all you have to say, really, and then the rest of the conversation just happens for you. But that's really all I know. To the extent that we know, what happened with the 43, and it became a big point of focus in U.S. media, Tlatlaya did not. Right, and you want to talk about official killings and disappearances. I think that there are probably a significant number of examples over the last few years that we don't know about in which the military or police have used excessive force or lethal force to take down supposed bad guys, where in fact, if we were able to investigate those cases, they were really simply extrajudicial executions. And I would say it's almost impossible to know to what extent that's true or in how many cases that's true, but it is a very significant unanswered question when you have massively deployed the military and federal police personnel throughout the country, and you've basically given anybody with a badge and a gun or a helmet and a gun carte blanche to assert security at the local level. The other questions about, this was, I think, about the Zetas. I think it's really hard for me. My guess, and it's only a guess, is that I think that the Zetas are significantly weakened to the point that they won't be able to reassert themselves effectively as a force. But I think that in the absence of that, I think that we may see the reestablishment or configuration of the old Gulf cartel networks. I think that they had the most to gain and gained the greatest advantage by seeing the downfall of the Zetas. Even though a number of high-level Gulf people have been taken out, what that has actually, I think, done for the Gulf cartel is to reduce internal frictions within that organization that may actually allow it to emerge stronger. So I'm not at all certain about that. As I said, I think those are guesses, but I think that it's not the same threat that it was a year ago, or particularly a year and a half ago. So it's my guess.
So I'd like to continue with your question. Is it am I looking at the right lady who asked the question with the pink? Okay. The status of Los Zetas in 2015, I would for the most part agree with David's comments. You know, despite the arrests of major leaders, the question is going to remain, what are the dynamics with the other group that are going to enable Los Zetas to whatever capacity it has and the capabilities that it has to retain territory throughout Mexico. And I'm looking, so when I look at Tamaulipas and Veracruz, there's some cities where they're really, if you will, that they own, you know, the plazas, right? So the question is, can they continue to retain that? Would they, I don't know about some type of rapprochement with the Gulf Cartel. I think there's too much antagonism. You know, there could be a possibility of some type of collaboration with the cartel of the Jalisco Nueva Generación, the new Jalisco generation that has started moving into some of the cities in Veracruz. So, you know, where are these wild cards, if you will, that would enable the Zetas to continue to operate? And to operate, you need to have your physical territory. You need to control your territory. You need to keep those routes open. So if it's considerably weakened, look to the Gulf Cartel to essentially decapitate it. And then, I mean, that's just assuming the Gulf Cartel is strong enough to do so. That's a very moving picture. And I'm certainly not in any way fully knowledgeable of all the dynamics ongoing right now in that organization, but just some thoughts. With respect to the question on Pemex, I'm looking for the woman who asked the question. That was your question. I was looking at the wrong, excuse me, I was looking at the wrong person. So very good question about the rise of sindicatos, or the role of sindicatos, though there has also been a rise of them in terms of labor protests and labor unrest for good reason, it's understandably. You know, throughout the last year, some of the protests in Mexico City and in other states did turn violent. The labor unions with many, obviously with significant Pemex workers and in some small towns and cities throughout Mexico, you know, marched hand in hand even with educators as well as students who had their own grievances. But the main concern is, how is this going to impact me? So for the sindicatos is, you know, the energy reform is really, it favors exterior interests, if you will, more than it favors the interior interest. In other words, it's going to favor there are many names of the U.S. energy companies. I won't name them here, not to identify any one. But if you look at the social media sites in Spanish, you know, there are criticisms of these majors coming in and essentially displacing Pemex workers. And this just builds into the whole theme of the president's economic reform. So how is this energy reform going to benefit, you know, the common Mexican? I'll also just note that the momentum, if you will, of these more disruptive closing down large neighborhoods and cities, where it forces the police to come out, this momentum seems to have declined. It did bring together a lot of these groups. I think as you look forward to, and I just want to make sure that I note this correctly, as you look to, I think it's López Obrador's mentioned that there might be a referendum on the energy reform in 2015. Is that the type of fuel, if you will, that's going to sort of reignite these feelings of uncertainty? And again, what does the energy reform really mean for me when it's all about private investment coming in, and Pemex is already so corrupt? And so those are some of my thoughts on that. Thank you for asking.
There's a question about activists and journalists and targeting the, let me just say, I've always been struggling, a thing David said, Guerrero has 7 Army battalions and some other units, but I've always been struck by the way in which human rights violations and whatnot are specific to a particular battalion's jurisdiction. And then the commander of that jurisdiction will cycle out and the human rights accusations dry up. They're never investigated, but it seems to be at a pretty local level where this corruption that is leading to these violence is happening. I don't think that there's a systematic institutional sort of thing. And I'll go back to the activists and journalists and others. You know, if I were to choose an occupational category to avoid in Guerrero today, a taxi driver, I wouldn't go near that one. But journalists and activists, someone sort of, I won't say that they aren't killed or threatened and whatnot, but I don't think at a higher rate than others in the state. It's possible to anger the wrong person easily in Guerrero and get yourself victimized, killed, something, and journalists, activists, and others can do that too. But I don't think there's a specific targeting of them. I guess that's the way I would respond to that. Journalists supply me with vast amounts of information. They're very, very good at reporting information, and I don't have that many of them who have been killed. I can't say that they're being killed in the same proportion as everybody, but that's my sense, I guess.
Let me thank the panel very much. I'm going to turn it over to Duncan. You can organize this for the rest of
Thank you. We're going to take a very short break, about 5 minutes, so please go and get yourself a cup of coffee, and then we'll reconvene here at 4 o'clock to kick off the second panel. Many thanks.
Show some appreciation.
Absolutely.
Your French was impeccable.
Impeccable.
It was
Impeccable.